Okay, so today we're really diving deep into pacifism. And this is something that I think is particularly interesting for folks like us who really like to think about the ethical implications of things. Um, and we have this fantastic resource you sent us, this Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on pacifism. Really,
Yeah.
just this great comprehensive overview of all things pacifism. And so, let's really unpack it. Let's get into what is pacifism really about? What are the different flavors of pacifism, and how do philosophers really think about war and peace and how they relate?
Yeah, I agree. The Stanford entry is a fantastic starting point for us, really rigorous and kind of, lays out the different ways of thinking about pacifism and kind of the key arguments for and against. So I think we'll have a really interesting conversation as we go through this.
Yeah. I think so too. So just starting right off with the word pacifism itself, you see right away that it has these Latin roots, right? Pax meaning peace, and efficus meaning making. So literally peacemaking, and we see this modern usage kind of coming from the French Pacifisme,
Yeah.
like back in 1901. But the idea itself, the commitment to peace, that goes way back,
Way.
back.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see it even in, early Christianity, the Sermon on the Mount, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. That's a very clear articulation of valuing peace. And it's interesting because even there, you have the Greek ironopoios and the Latin pacifici, which, they really kind of emphasize this active role, right? It's not just about passively avoiding conflict. It's about, actually creating peace, making peace.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really important right from the start to distinguish between just, kind of a general desire for peace, which I think, most people probably have, right? Versus, this really specific philosophical position, right?
Yeah.
This deep commitment to pacifism as a principle. As the entry points out, it's not just about being, against war or being nonviolent in some, general sense. It's a much more specific and nuanced position than that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's helpful to kind of break that down a bit, right? So you have this broad commitment to nonviolence, which Robert Holmes, I think, he even suggests the term nonviolentism, right, as kind of a term to encompass this opposition to all forms of violence, not just, war itself,
Yeah.
but then, you have this more focused anti-war stance. So it's important to see the different levels there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not just, an emotional kind of reaction against war, right? Like, oh, war is bad, I don't like it. It can be this very reasoned, this very principled ethical framework, this way of looking at the world, and that then kind of brings us to, how pacifism fits within the broader landscape of, ethical thinking about war.
Exactly. And the entry, I think it does a nice job of laying that out. It kind of gives us this spectrum, right? So on the one end, you have, realism
Yeah.
and realists, they're basically saying, look, when it comes to war, morality doesn't really apply. It's all about power and national interests. And then, on the other end, you have, pacifism, which is saying, no, war is always wrong. But then somewhere in between there, you have just war theory, right? Which, it's saying, okay, well, maybe war can be justified sometimes, but there need to be these very specific conditions met. And so, that's where this fundamental question comes in, right? This question of, can war be justified?
Right, right. Yeah. It's this really deep question. And the way it's phrased in the entry is really good, right? It's like, can war be justified? Like not is war justified or isn't it, but is it even possible to justify war?
Yeah, yeah. And that's where you get this really rich and interesting discussion, right?
Yeah.
Between, just war theory and pacifism. Because some philosophers, they say, well, look, the conditions for a just war, they're so rarely met, especially in modern warfare. It's so difficult to meet all the criteria. And so they argue that practically speaking, pacifism is kind of the logical conclusion.
Oh, interesting. So it's like they're coming at it from this just war perspective, but saying, you know what, it's just so unlikely that a war will ever be just.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Larry May, he calls this contingent pacifism. The idea is that, it's contingent on the actual circumstances, right? But given the realities of modern warfare, it's almost always the case that war will be unjust. But then you have other philosophers, like John Sturba, who actually try to reconcile reconcile just war theory and pacifism, and they talk about just war pacifism, and the idea there is that maybe there's this way to kind of bring those two things together.
Okay. So it's almost like maybe you can have a version of just war theory that's so restrictive, so careful about when war is justified, that it kind of ends up looking a lot like pacifism in practice.
Yeah. That's kind of the idea. But then you have other philosophers, right, who are more critical of just war theory altogether. People like Ryan and Holmes, and they argue that the framework itself, this just war framework, it can actually be problematic because it can kind of obscure the moral gravity of killing. This organized, systematic killing that is at the heart of war. Holmes he emphasizes that really the central moral problem of war is this intentional killing. And he thinks that just war theory sometimes kind of downplays that. So it's there's a really interesting debate about, can we ever have these criteria that truly justify, mass violence?
Right. Yeah. And it really makes you think about your own kind of foundational assumptions, right? About the value of human life and whether, violence, even state-sanctioned violence, can ever be, truly legitimate. Okay, so moving on a bit. The entry talks about this common understanding of pacifism as basically this principled rejection of war and killing, and that's generally how people think about it, right? But then there's this less common distinction, this idea of pacificism with a hyphen versus pacifism without the hyphen, and the entry says that pacificism might refer to just like a general kind of inclination towards peace, not necessarily ruling out war altogether, but it seems like pacifism without the hyphen, that's really become the standard term, right, for this more robust rejection of war and violence.
Yeah, pacifism has definitely become the more common term, I think, and it's interesting because it can encompass these different critical perspectives on war and violence, but it's important to keep in mind what you mentioned earlier, right, about the Orwellian warning, this idea of pacification, because sometimes language that sounds peaceful, it can actually be used to mask violent oppression, and so that's something to always be aware of, right? This potential for deceptive rhetoric when it comes to conflict. But yeah, I think at its core, as the entry says, pacifism is really about this rejection of violent means for achieving peace. It's based on this fundamental idea that doesn't make right. Just because you can achieve something through violence doesn't mean it's morally justified.
Right. Yeah, that's really important. Okay, so we've kind of laid some groundwork here, talking about the term pacifism itself. But let's dive a bit deeper into this idea of peace. Particularly how philosophers understand it. Because the entry points out that peace, it's not this simple, straightforward concept, right? It's what they call a family resemblance term, meaning it has all these different related meanings. And often, I think the first thing that comes to mind is this negative definition of peace, right? Like peace as the absence of war or violence.
Yeah. And that's often called, negative peace, right? It's just the cessation of hostilities, no more fighting. But for philosophers, there's this deeper level of analysis, and thinkers in peace studies, people like Galtung and Borsema, they talk about this concept of positive peace. And this is much more expansive, right? It's not just about the absence of fighting, but the presence of, these cooperative, harmonious relationships. It's about social justice. It's about, human flourishing. It's really about creating the conditions where, everyone can thrive and live a good life.
Right. Yeah. So it's not just like, okay, the guns are silent now, so everything's good. It's like, okay, but what are the underlying conditions? Is there still, systemic violence? Is there still injustice? These deeper issues.
Exactly. And the entry also touches on this idea of the scale of peace, right? So you can have peace at, the interpersonal level, between two people, or at a small group level, but then you can also have peace at, national level, or even, international and global peace. And Sims and Delamy, they talk about this, how the challenges and the realities of peace, they change depending on the scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so another really interesting point that the entry brings up is this idea of the nature of peace, because Rousseau, he famously critiqued this idea of a peace that's imposed through oppression, like a silence that's enforced by a tyrant. That's not real peace, right? From a philosophical standpoint, a peace that's achieved through slavery or submission, where injustice prevails. That's not genuine peace.
No, absolutely not. And that connects to this really important point, this idea that pacifism is not passive, right? It's not passivism. Most pacifists, they advocate for active but nonviolent resistance to injustice. So the key distinction there is in the means, right? How do you address conflict? How do you address injustice?
Right, right, yeah. And that's really key, right? Because I think sometimes people have this image of pacifists as being, just kind of passive in the face of wrongdoing, and that's not accurate, right?
No, not at all. Although, the entry does mention that there are, some people like Tolstoy who did advocate for non-resistance, right? Drawing on, certain interpretations of the Sermon on the Mount, that emphasis on turning the other cheek. So even within pacifism, there are these different nuances, right? These different ways of thinking about how to respond to violence.
Right, right, yeah. And then you have this idea of peace as a modus vivendi,
Yeah.
right? Or just a truce, basically.
Right.
Where maybe the peace is just based on fear or a kind of stalemate, like during the Cold War, for example.
Yeah. And Kant, he rejected this idea of a modus vivendi as true peace. He said, genuine peace, it requires an end to all hostilities,
Yeah.
right? Not just a temporary cessation of fighting. And there can't be these secret reservations,
Yeah.
these plans for future conflict. And I think most pacifists would agree with Kant on this, a peace that's built on the threat of violence, it's inherently unstable, right? And it's morally problematic.
Yeah, yeah. So true peace, it has to be based on something more than just, a balance of power.
Exactly. And this contrasts with, this idea of a peace, a just and tranquil order, which, this is an idea that you see in thinkers like Augustine, Kant, and more recently, people like Fukuyama and Rawls. And the idea here is that, peace, it comes from the absence of deep-seated grievances. It comes from having a well-ordered society,
Hmm.
where there's justice, where there's, a lack of hostility. And this is often linked to, liberal democracy. But of course, the just war tradition, it argues that military force can sometimes be necessary, to establish or defend this kind of order, like through humanitarian intervention, for example. But pacifists, they fundamentally challenge this. They say, no, violent means they can't be used to achieve these ends,
Yeah.
because violence itself is antithetical to justice and human rights.
Right.
Right. So it's this question of, can you really achieve a just outcome, a truly just and peaceful world through means that are themselves, morally problematic.
Exactly. And then finally, the entry talks about this idea of peace, not just as a political condition, but as a virtue, as an intrinsic value. And this is something that you see in a lot of different thinkers. People like Fox, McDaniel, even Pope Francis, Augustine, Kant, they all talk about peace as a way of life. It's not just about the absence of war. It's about embodying these virtues of, tolerance, compassion, mutual respect. McDaniel, he even talks about creative peace, this idea of actively building understanding and cooperation. And then you have this really powerful notion, right? This idea that peace is an end in itself. It's a summum bonum. And that's something that Augustine and Kant, they both argue for.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really profound idea, right? It's like peace isn't just valuable because it leads to other good things. It's valuable in and of itself.
Exactly. And that leads to this really interesting idea in the metaethics of pacifism, right? This idea of moral intuitionism. So Fiala and Holmes, they talk about this. And the idea is that, we don't just know the value of peace through, calculating the consequences or thinking about it instrumentally. It's something that we know more directly, through our moral sensibilities. So it's a much deeper kind of moral commitment than just a calculated, cost-benefit analysis.
Right. Yeah. Wow. So much to unpack there.
Yeah.
Even just with this concept of peace. So for philosophers, it's not just a simple idea. It's this really rich, multifaceted concept. But okay. So moving on now. Let's talk about the different kinds of pacifism, because the entry it gives us this really helpful kind of categorization. It lays out these key distinctions in how pacifism is understood and applied. And one of the fundamental distinctions is between absolute and contingent pacifism.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. It's really about, how universal is your rejection of violence, right? So absolute pacifism, that's the most extreme form, right? It's a complete and total rejection of war and violence in all circumstances. And it's often grounded in moral absolutism, right? This idea that
Yeah.
certain actions are just inherently wrong no matter what. And Michael Allen Fox, he argues for this strong form of pacifism. He says, even military intervention to prevent genocide or other really horrific human rights violations. He says even that is wrong. And Holmes, he kind of echoes this. He says, morality and warfare, they're just fundamentally incompatible. And this kind of absolute pacifism, it's often connected to religious beliefs, right? Gandhi, for example, his pacifism was rooted in his metaphysical beliefs. And then you have, this Christian principle of non-resistance, which comes from the Sermon on the Mount. And then you have, ahimsa in Indian philosophy, which emphasizes non-harm. So there are all these different religious and philosophical traditions that support this idea of absolute pacifism.
Right. Right. And it's interesting because even someone like Gandhi, who's often seen as like, the embodiment of absolute pacifism. Even he recognized that it's really difficult, right, to live up to that ideal perfectly, in a world where even just surviving can involve, some form of harm. And so he focused a lot on, the intention behind actions and minimizing harm. So yeah, even absolute pacifism, it's complex. But then on the other hand, you have contingent pacifism. And this is a less absolute form, right?
Yeah, it's less absolute. So it might be, a principled opposition to a particular war, or the belief that pacifism is a moral obligation for a particular group or in certain circumstances, but not necessarily, a universal requirement for everyone. And the contingency, it can be based on all sorts of things, right? The nature of the conflict, the likely consequences, the available alternatives. So there are a lot of different forms of contingent pacifism.
Okay. So it's not always this all or nothing kind of thing, right? Like some pacifists, they might say, okay, well, there might be some very rare circumstances where war is justified.
Right, exactly. And you have people like Einstein and Russell,
Sure.
right, who are generally pacifists, but they famously supported World War II, right? They said, look, in this particular case, against this existential threat of Nazi Germany, we have to fight back. And Russell, he even called his position relative political pacifism. So the pacifism was relative to the political context. And then you have Courtwright, who talks about realistic pacifism, and he says, okay, when it comes to nuclear war, that's always wrong because of the potential for just utter catastrophe. But then he says, okay, maybe in other conflicts, conventional conflicts, maybe there could be a justification for using force, maybe in self-defense or to protect innocent people. But even then, there would need to be these very strict conditions met.
Okay, so even within contingent pacifism, you have these different approaches.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have vocational pacifism, where it's seen as a duty associated with a certain role, like within a religious community. Then you have prudential pacifism, which it's based on this kind of pragmatic assessment of the likely consequences of war. Then you have just war pacifism, where the argument is that modern warfare, it almost never meets the criteria for a just war. And then you have political or strategic pacifism, where the opposition to war is based more on strategy than on a fundamental moral objection to violence. And then you even have Holmes, who talks about liberal democratic pacifism, and his argument is that modern warfare, it's just incompatible with core liberal values. So all of these different forms of contingent pacifism, they're all based on these empirical judgments, right, about the nature of war, the history of war, and the application of certain ethical or political principles.
Right. Yeah. So it's really not as simple as just saying, are you a pacifist or not?
Yeah.
There's this whole spectrum of belief and commitment. Okay. So then, another distinction that the entry brings up is between maximal and minimal pacifism. And this gets into, the extent of the rejection of violence. So maximal pacifism, it's a complete rejection of all forms of violence. And it's closely aligned with absolute and universal pacifism.
Yeah.
But then you have minimal pacifism, which is more restricted. It's kind of a narrower focus, right? And it tends to be more associated with contingent and particular forms of pacifism.
Right. And this raises some really interesting questions, right? Like, for a minimal pacifist, could civil war ever be justified? Or what about humanitarian intervention? Are there any cases where those things might be justified? And historically, you have someone like William Lloyd Garrison, right, who was a pacifist, but then he ended up supporting the Civil War in the U.S. because he thought it was necessary to end slavery. So even someone who's committed to pacifism, they might have to make these really difficult choices in certain situations.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really powerful example. But then also, even among maximal pacifists, there's this question of what counts as violence. So some pacifists they take this seamless garment approach, and they oppose all taking of life. So they would be against things like capital punishment or eating meat or abortion. But then other pacifists, they might focus more specifically on the principle of non-combatant immunity. So they would say, the real moral problem is deliberately harming innocent people. And Gandhi, with his idea of ahimsa, that's a good example of a maximal pacifist who really opposed all forms of harm.
Right. Right. And then you have this other distinction, right, between universal and particular pacifism. So this is about, who is obligated to be a pacifist? Is it everyone? Or is it a personal choice? And this relates to the other distinctions we've talked about, right? Absolute versus contingent, maximal versus minimal. But specifically with this distinction, you have things like vocational pacifism, right? Where it's seen as this calling for certain people or for certain groups, and then you have conscientious objection, right? Which is the individual refusal to participate in war. And then Reitan, he talks about personal pacifism, and this is where someone, they might be a pacifist in their own life, but they don't necessarily condemn others for participating in war. But of course, critics of particular pacifism, they might say, well, look, if war is wrong, then it's wrong for everyone, right? It's not just a matter of personal choice.
Right. Yeah. It's like, is there a universal moral principle here, or is it just to each their own? Okay, so then we have skeptical and prima facie pacifism, and Ryan, he talks about this, and this is really interesting because it's kind of a different way of thinking about pacifism. It's not necessarily about saying that violence is always wrong. It's more about being skeptical of the justifications for violence, and particularly for war. So Ryan, he says pacifism is this skeptical position, and it questions the very legitimacy of taking human life, even in self-defense.
Yeah, and this connects to the last resort criterion in just war theory, right? So the idea there is that war can only be justified as a last resort after all other peaceful options have been exhausted. But skeptical pacifists, they question whether we can ever really be sure that all other options have been tried. And they emphasize this need for repeated attempts at peaceful resolution. And then there's this other layer of skepticism too, right, which is directed at governments. And their justifications for war. So Fiala, he talks about this practical political pacifism, and the idea is that citizens, we should always be skeptical of the reasons that governments give for going to war. We should demand proof.
Right. Yeah, it's like, don't just take their word for it. Really scrutinize their claims. Okay, so then this skepticism, it can then lead to prima facie pacifism.
Yeah.
Which is this idea that war is generally wrong. Right. So if someone's going to argue for war, they have this heavy burden of proof. They have to really show that in this particular case, war is necessary.
Yeah, exactly. It sets this really high bar, right, for justifying war. Okay, and then finally you have transformational pacifism. And this is a bit different because it's not just about opposing war, right? It's about this broader goal of changing the underlying conditions that lead to war. So it's about changing our psychology, our culture, our social structures. It's about getting rid of militarism and this glorification of war and violence.
Right. So it's like, instead of just saying don't fight this war, it's saying let's change the way we think about conflict altogether.
Exactly. And, the entry, it gives some really good examples of this, right? It talks about Jesus, how he offered this radical reevaluation of values, right? He said, don't retaliate against evil. And then you have Gandhi, who believed that history was progressing towards ahimsa. And then Fahey, he talks about this reconstructionist pacifism. And he says, we need to completely transform the international order, to prioritize human rights and justice. And then there's this really important connection to feminist thought, and the ethics of care. So people like Adams, Ruddick, Noddings, they talk about this, and they critique these traditional masculine values, that are associated with aggression and violence. And they say, we need to focus on values like care and empathy and solidarity, if we want to build a truly peaceful world.
Right. Yeah, it's this much broader vision of peace, right? It's not just about treaties and agreements between states. It's about changing our hearts and minds. Okay, so we've talked about all these different types of pacifism, but let's also get into some of the philosophical arguments for and against pacifism. And the entry starts with consequentialist arguments. So consequentialist pacifism, it's often based on this idea of rule utilitarianism. And this is this ethical theory that says, we should follow the rules that lead to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people.
Right. And so from this perspective, the argument is that a general rule against war, that's going to lead to the best outcome overall.
Yeah.
It's going to minimize suffering. It's going to maximize well-being. And Bentham, he famously said, war it's just this huge source of suffering, even for the victors. There's always a cost. And so consequentialist pacifists, they point to this evidence, this historical evidence that war it tends to produce more harm than good.
Right. Yeah. But then, of course, there are people who argue for just war theory from a utilitarian perspective. They say, well, look, sometimes war can actually prevent even greater suffering. Like if you think about, humanitarian intervention, for example.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where the debate gets really interesting, right? Because it becomes about weighing the potential consequences, and making these really difficult judgments about what's likely to happen. And some consequentialist pacifists, they might say, okay, well, maybe there are some very rare cases where war is justified, based on the specific circumstances. But then others might say, no, even then the long-term consequences of war, they're just too negative. They'll say, look, war erodes international law. It perpetuates cycles of violence. It's just not worth it.
Yeah. And it's interesting because with consequentialist pacifism, it's not necessarily about saying that killing is inherently wrong, right? It's more about the overall balance of good and bad outcomes. So the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, it doesn't have the same kind of moral weight.
Mm-hmm.
But then the challenge for consequentialist pacifists, it's that it can be really difficult to predict the consequences of war, right? Like some people will say, oh, well, violence is actually declining overall. But then others will say, no, but there are all these hidden costs, these long-term effects that we don't always see.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important to think about the scope of the consequences, right?
Yeah.
So are we just thinking about the